All right, I guess it's 11:35. We can get going. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Converge 2021. For today's session, Samir and I are your hosts. We both are business analysts with ThoughtWorks, and our speaker, Ramya. Ramya works as a product manager with ThoughtWorks. She is a highly experienced product consultant with experience stretching across multiple industries and multiple business problems. Her sectoral experience includes financial services, not for profits, healthcare, and retail. In addition to helping envision product strategy, she is also skilled at driving consensus in the face of complex stakeholders or organizational dynamics. With that, let's jump into the talk. The topic for today's talk is reimagining innovation in enterprises in the context of digital ecosystems. With that, I'd like to hand over to Ramya and we can get started. Thank you all.
Thanks, Neha. Thanks for that introduction. So hi, everyone. Welcome to the talk. Let me quickly share my screen and we should get started. So as Neha was saying, today I will be talking about reimagining enterprise innovation in the context of digital ecosystems. To add a bit more context to that, I am currently working as part of the digital ecosystem strategy team within ThoughtWorks. And as part of this team, we usually consult with our clients and help them envision an ecosystem strategy for their businesses. Now, in the face of a lot of change in recent times, right? Especially with the pandemic, a lot has changed, and everybody is pushed more and more towards a digital outlay for their businesses. So I am going to talk a little more about how digital ecosystem thinking is going to help businesses that are inherently not digital, right? They are even for digital non-native enterprises, such as the ones who do not typically claim software development as a core competency. I will talk how ecosystem thinking helps them move closer to digitization, and also how it should be a key strategy in their business strategy. Right. So with that, let me get started. As I was saying, digitalization and digitization, digital transformation, these are terms that we've been hearing for a long time, right? For a long time now, companies have actively invested in digital transformation initiatives within their organizations, especially now in the face of the pandemic where everything is turning more virtual and more digital. That pace has actually accelerated. So if you look at some of the numbers here, just between now and 2023, they are looking to invest about $6.8 trillion in digital transformations, right? To put that into perspective, back in 2019, just before the COVID pandemic hit us, it was about just 2 trillion, right? Just a third of what people are investing today. A lot of the organizations are also fast tracking their investments. So again, if you look at just the percentage of products that are digitalized today, they have pulled up their timelines. They're accelerating the investments, and things have moved by as much as 7 years, where people are now bringing up products that were not in their roadmap for 7 years from now, but they're actually investing in them right away, right? So it is quite evident that there is so much investment happening in digital initiatives across the industry, right? Having said that, 78% of these are still not yielding the results that people want, right? There are many reasons for this, right? Some of the ones that stand out are the first one being, especially in enterprises, the digital strategy, the business strategy, and the tech strategy, they all don't necessarily tie together. Now, what do I mean by this? We're all familiar with how for a long time, traditionally, businesses have operated where the business org and the tech org have been two different entities in businesses, right? And that has changed. Definitely, that has changed in recent years. So despite that, we still see there is no clear coherence or no clear synergy between the business, tech, and digital strategies. Now, if you explore this a little more under the hood, what typically is one of the reasons that stands out for this is that a lot of times, even if you were to take, if you were to take a digital non-native, for example, right? When I say digital non-native, think about companies such as a telecom provider or a healthcare provider who don't necessarily have software development as their core competency, right? And so when you bring leaders from these industries, they're not necessarily thinking about how the new biggest digital initiative, such as building a new platform, how is it directly going to translate into a revenue uptick for them, right? They definitely have advisors. A lot of consultants are helping out these kinds of companies, but very soon you will see that this is not their core expertise, and sometimes even if they have the right intent, some of these bets really don't pay off, right? And that is also typically the case with many other enterprises, right? Given that these enterprises have been established for a while, they have core engines that are their main revenue streams. Whenever they look at digital investments, they usually try to de-risk that from their core business. And usually digital investments are more of a smaller, a cordoned off kind of an investment or a small bet that they place within the enterprise. Now, as a result of that, of course, if the bet doesn't fly, then the risk to the main business is minimal. However, if the bet does succeed, even then the impact that it creates is fairly small, given that it is already a small bet, and they have tried to de-risk the entire business, kind of riding on this bet. Right. So these kinds of incremental growth are not really enough to bring about transformation at scale at these enterprises. The next thing is also about digitalization and digitization. Again, there are enough number of articles on Google that will tell you what the difference is, right? If you look under it, inherently, it is about how the tech strategy or the digital entity in an organization doesn't, they're not able to influence beyond a thin line of folks in their organization. The digital wing is seen as something separate to the rest of the organization. And as a result, a lot of the initiatives are not really are not really embraced in the right spirit, and they lead to silos as a result of that. Right. So when you look at all of these different patterns, one thing that stands out is these are not some of these strategies have actually worked in the case of startups, right? It's not necessarily true that these kinds of strategies don't work at all times. However, the difference, as you might have noticed, is that a lot of these strategies are geared towards startups, right? Not necessarily an enterprise. And if you again try to understand what the differences are, a startup is typically resource scarce. A startup is trying to build that one product, trying to address the consumer needs, and trying to build that really well, get a foothold in the market and grow to scale, as compared to an enterprise, which is not really resource scarce in the same way as a startup is. Right? In an enterprise, typically you have multiple bets running in parallel all at the same time. And hence, this kind of an approach where the enterprise, is advised to place maybe a minimal bet, trying to play lean, and trying to play an incremental game doesn't necessarily work or doesn't necessarily bring the same kinds of outcomes that a startup would see. Right. Similarly, when the startup is designing their product and trying to, grow that product, they are more focused on seeing how the market receives that product. And then depending on how the market's response is, they are open to tweaking that product. And hence, they will ensure that there is a great product market fit. For the enterprise, however, beyond the product market fit, there is also the organization aspect that needs to be considered. The enterprise already has established channels of revenue. They are carrying some inertia, no doubt. There is a lot of baggage that comes with the enterprise. The enterprise is cognizant of the shareholder value that they're generating. And there is already, well, to some extent, a deep-rooted organizational culture that comes with these enterprises, right? And it is important that whenever the organization is placing these bets, they take into account everything, all the strengths that they have, all the weaknesses that they have, in terms of putting together what their strategy has to be. And hence, beyond the product market fit, there is also the organizational aspect that needs to be embedded into their strategy. all of these have to be quite coherent. All of these have to be very intentional and deliberate in terms of how the enterprise is envisioning the next stage for their growth, right? As a result, we cannot directly apply a lot of these concepts that have worked very well for startups, but need additional strategies, additional perspectives when you put them in the context of an enterprise. So here is where I'd like to introduce the concept of ecosystem thinking, suggest in the same way that we have product thinking that helps with designing or, with structural, with a structured approach to product building. Ecosystem thinking is the approach we'd like to recommend that keeps enterprise context at the forefront and helps in envisioning their digital transformation initiatives. Right. As I was saying, when you consider a product, when you consider a startup, they've typically gone with building that one product, building it right, finding a product market fit, and growing to scale. Right. Typically, when they've, in normal circumstances, this product has grown. It now probably has multiple products that the startup is working on, and they're probably growing across multiple regions. And when they start realizing that they're probably repeating a lot of these steps across these different regions, that's when they start to internalize a lot of these processes and try to reduce the time to market. That is what leads to platform thinking. And again, product thinking and platform thinking are fairly well understood concepts in the current scenario of the industry. Right. And in the case of a startup, it is quite important that the startup starts to embrace the existing ecosystem around it. This is how the startup is able to entrench to a larger degree in the ecosystem around it. And hence, that is what leads to an ecosystem play for the startup, right? The startup could be the orchestrator or the creator of this ecosystem, or they could also just plug in with existing ecosystems. But in the end, they are looking for a lot more influence, a lot more relevance in that ecosystem. So typically for most startups, the journey is left to right. I recommend for enterprises, the journey be more right to left. What do I mean by that? So for enterprises, it is important that as we've seen, a lot of these small bets or incremental bets don't necessarily yield the results for the enterprises that work very well for startups. So it is important for an enterprise to understand what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and then try and define a North Star vision that will incorporate and embrace the strengths, the reality for the enterprise, right? So this North Star vision is going to help them bring together or tie together the different org units within the enterprise, ensure that all of their different realities are strung together in the form of a more coherent long-term strategy for the enterprise. Now, once this North Star vision or the long-term strategy has been defined, that is when the enterprise will be required to work backwards to understand what are the different constituents or the components that make up this vision. How do I go back and understand what are those individual products that I need to build? What are the strengths I need to gather? And where do I need to lean on a platform approach to kind of make this vision a reality? Okay. I will maybe take a pause here, see if there are any questions. If not, we're at the halfway mark. I can continue and take questions in the end. Okay.
Okay, and also just an FYI to the audience, even if you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to add that to the chat. Ramya will help us with that towards the end of the talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, folks. So let me continue. So as I was saying, right, a lot of us have definitely heard the term ecosystems, and in recent times, ecosystems have actually become quite synonymous with a whole range of other ideas as well, in terms of a suite of products, in terms of platforms that are built or portals that are built, and so on, right? So ecosystems are definitely not new. If you look at the current state of world affairs, you have 6 of the top 7 companies in terms of market value actually have an ecosystem play in their business. Right. And even a lot of the even a lot of the leaders at the various organizations are very cognizant of this shift in the industry. Today, they're actively looking at incorporating ecosystem as a growth strategy in their annual reports and boardroom discussions and so on. If you look at some of these stats, ecosystem or ecosystem related companies are expected to grow to a significant portion of the total global revenues in the next few years. So ecosystems are definitely here and now, and they're here to stay. Right. So just in the same way, as I was saying, product thinking allows or helps us with a systematic methodology for intentionally building effective products. So does ecosystem thinking allows for a systematic methodology for enterprises to intentionally build viable ecosystems. If you look around, there are enough number of playbooks that talk about how to go about building a product in a lean manner, but not nearly any in the ecosystem space. And my teams and I, our attempt is at building this playbook, building a framework to talk about how do you go about intentionally building ecosystems. So with this illustration, I'll try to explain a bit about what typically goes on behind the scenes when you want to build an ecosystem, right? So let's consider any industry. Typically, you have a bunch of consumers on one hand and a bunch of suppliers on the other end. And given that it has a few different vendors along your supply chain, there are a few intermediaries, a few other intermediary businesses along the way. Now, these are some of the typical functions you have in the value chain that help in tying together this value chain, right? Things such as customer acquisition, payments, customer service, regulatory aspects, vendor management, your data aspects, all of these different things. And the fact that this end-to-end value chain is spread across so many different players means that it is definitely a fragmented industry. It also means that given that value hops across a lot of these different intermediary nodes, there is value leakage. And as a result, there are explicit points of friction along this value chain. It is typically these points of friction that become prime spots for a new entrant to this industry to start attacking or start addressing first. Right. So if you look at any incumbent, any industry, it is these points of friction where the startup, any new startup will try to come and, kind of find their footing. They will try and understand what the needs or what the cause of discontent at these points are, and try to build a product that very well addresses and fills out these gaps. Now, once they start to do that and start to do that really well, they are able to grow to scale so much so that they might actually become the de facto standard for those functions in the industry. And this is when they are able to unseat the incumbent. This is when the incumbent starts to lose relevance in the industry and possibly gets disintermediated, right? This is how typically a lot of disruptions happen. And this is, this is the typical pattern that a lot of startups approach to unseat the enterprises or the incumbent enterprises, right? With ecosystem thinking, we are recommending a 3-step process or a process that's centered on 3 key principles that will help enterprises preempt a lot of these disruptions or, co-ride a lot of these disruptions, right? The one interesting or the one important aspect to call out is there are ecosystems all around us. It is, of course, it is helpful to be part of an ecosystem and continue to stay relevant in the value chain. But what is more important is if the enterprise is able to find a way to build their own ecosystem, to orchestrate that own ecosystem, then they can continue to wield influence across the value chain and bring and build a stronger relevance for themselves in the value chain. So the first principle to that effect is the enterprise has to look for ways to optimize for their relevance. So what do I mean by this? As I was saying, the minute or, from the time where somebody starts to disrupt an enterprise, that is when the enterprise starts to lose relevance in that value chain. And as a result, it becomes easy for a new entrant to that industry to unseat the enterprise. But if the enterprise is able to think ahead, identify these points of friction in the value chain and try to work towards optimizing for that relevance, to continue to stay relevant, then for any new entrant, it becomes easier for them to partner with the enterprise as opposed to actually starting out in isolation, working in isolation and going ground up and competing with the enterprise versus actually partnering with the enterprise. The second principle is internalizing tech complexity. Again, let's take the example of how Google went about starting out, or helping played a key role in the Android OS creation. So back in the early days of the smartphone industry, when Apple was kind of racing ahead with their own smartphones and their own OS, Google was starting to lose relevance in the smartphone industry. Right? They tried. There were a lot of hardware manufacturers in terms of Motorola, Samsung, and the others who were trying to catch up with Apple. And at this point in time, it was important for Google to find a footing in the industry. They internalized a lot of the operating system complexity that existed in the industry in the form of building out Android. And they were able to partner with these hardware companies in the form of Android phones, which thus helped Google continue to remain relevant in the smartphone industry, right? So that is a good example of how, any new smartphone provider that came in, it was easy for them to kind of ride on top or, leverage the Android platform that is available to continue to focus on their hardware aspects of building a smartphone. And that is how Google continued to remain relevant in the smartphone industry. So this concept talks about how when the incumbent is able to preempt a lot of the disruption that could happen by actually internalizing or, building out the core platform for the other channel partners to partner with it, offer these in the form of services for the other partners to partner with it, it becomes, it helps in the enterprise continuing to remain or continuing to play a significant role across the whole value chain, as a result of which they are helping, they are actually finding themselves in a more stronger position across the value chain. This also, if this enterprise is also able to standardize a lot of these processes and help, and hence make this whole experience a lot more seamless, it helps with fragmentation present in the industry. Typically, fragmentation is anti-growth, and every time any of these processes get standardized, they become interoperable. They, it's easier for a new entrant to partner in that existing ecosystem. It strengthens the ecosystem, and as a result, the incumbent is continuing to wield influence across the whole value chain. So, as I was saying, a lot of these can be encapsulated in terms of these kinds of benefits for the organization. This approach or this kind of thinking definitely allows the enterprise to continue to grow their existing revenue engines, but at the same time also think about new revenue engines and be more intentional about what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and how can they bring all of these together in terms of what their new bets are going to be. Also, this helps them, preempt a lot of the disruption to some extent and help and hence co-ride a lot of these disruption along with their channel partners. Eventually helping this enterprise think more like what a digital first business would operate, and hence lose some of their internal blockages, lose some of their internal baggages, and hence move towards being more nimble and more digital first in their outlook. So that was a lot of theory, I do acknowledge. I do want to end this talk by providing a quick example of how we were able to incorporate this thinking in with one of our clients recently. So the scenario that you see here is that of an agri-business. Basically, it is a fertilizer provider company, and their problem statement was that they are already running a lot of these different digital initiatives, albeit in silos, right? So they have connect with the end farmers, and they already are actively engaging with their end farmers. They have multiple digital tools where they are engaging with the farmers on some of these tools and engaging with the agronomists and the other tools and so on, right? But they weren't really able to see a clear focus or a clear outcome of this in the form of revenue generation for the enterprise. And the ask when they approached us was, how do we tie all of these different initiatives together? How can we actually make them more holistic? And how can we actually, of course, revenue generation is one, but also make sure that these are tying into each other and provide a value that is far greater than the sum of the individual pieces, right? So as we started to understand this industry, and as we started to understand what are kind of the underpinnings of this industry, it became obvious that, let's take the example of the Indian farmer context, right? In the Indian farmer context, typically access to credit has always been a problem, right? The farmer is always faced with a challenge in terms of getting the right level of credit for his operations, as a result of which he's not able to invest into the right kinds of inputs into his farming, possibly not have access to the right kind of equipment to help out with his farming, farm hands to help out. And as a result, when the inputs start to suffer, the yield also starts to suffer. So the farmer is usually caught in this vicious cycle of, constrained inputs leading to constrained yield, and the same cycle repeats again, right? So it was important that this new solution, or this holistic solution that we're thinking of, is actually going to protect the end consumer of this value chain, right? Who is the farmer? It was important that the farmer is abstracted from some of the risks that they face on a day-to-day basis, right? If we're able to provide them some protection against the income uncertainty that they face, which also leads to yield uncertainty, it does appear like a lot of the structural issues, or a lot of these points of friction, as we were talking, will be addressed, and hence overall it might start feeding into this flywheel effect, where the better income, or the better protection the farmer has against income, it would lead to more predictable yield, which would lead to a better predictable business process, or a more predictable demand actually across the whole value chain. So one of the recommendations here was for this agribusiness, or the fertilizer business, to actually build out a digital platform. So they are already building multiple different, they already have engagement with the different communities in terms of various apps. But if you're able to pull all of these together into the form of a more cohesive digital platform, where this business owns the access to this the farmer community. And we can also assume that there is some level of KYC checks done on these farmer community, as a result of which they are able to easily onboard different channel partners along the way. So for example, if you want to provide crop insurance, you can bring in an insurance provider into this fold. If you want to provide additional credit access to farmers, bring in a microfinancing provider, equipment financer, and so on. And the benefit, or the incentive for a lot of these channel partners, is that there is already demand aggregation on one side, which this fertilizer company is accounting for. They are taking over your customer acquisition costs, and they will give you access to a pool of demand on the one end. And it is easier for a lot of these companies to then join this platform, on board onto this platform, and work synergistically with this fertilizer provider, so that everybody is keeping the interests of the farmer and the overall value chain benefits at the heart of their business, and they're able to work together and get to a state where the farmer is protected from a lot of these uncertainties that don't necessarily happen if it is a lot more fragmented, the industry. That is all I had. I can take a pause here and see if there are any more questions or any comments from the audience.
All right. Audience, if you do have any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you could post it in the chat. Either works fine.
Can I ask something?
Yeah, sure, Pawan. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Ramya. Thanks. I think it was a very insightful session on how the ecosystem can be more disruptive. So what I have observed is, as you rightly mentioned, in the ecosystem or value chain, so there are certain areas which are prone to disruption because there's a lot of inefficiency or there's a lot of friction, as you mentioned. And so we can see new startups are coming up and they're easily able to disrupt some areas of the entire value chain. So the reason of why they're able to do this is that maybe they don't have any legacy in terms of the technology, in terms of organizational structure, processes, and all those things, which helps them to quickly pivot on anything which is new, which is trending in the industry. So they can quickly come with a new kind of model, test in the market, and just get along and disrupt maybe one part of the value chain. So while enterprises, they are actually bogged down by a lot of legacy things, like too much invested into particular legacy technology, or they have their own ways of working. The structure of the organization itself doesn't allow us to digitalize as fast as they would like, because just doing it parts may not make much difference for them. So I was just wondering, you have given some very valuable inputs. So what they can do to be more nimble in such a case? So because maybe they're owning the entire value chain in some ways, and some new entrant comes up, and because they're so fast, so nimble, they're easily able to pivot on something and test in the market and come with the MVP and quickly um, add a value to some areas and just own that part of the value chain themselves, because customer sees more value with the new entrant than the enterprises. So just wanted to understand from your side as to how they can be more productive or more nimble to test new ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that, Pawan. And actually, you covered a lot of what I was going to say. It is true that enterprises carry a lot of that baggage, right? And in terms of how can they start to grow more nimble, I think it's a multi-layered approach, right? I think, I mean, one of the things that we advise when we speak with our clients is that we need to kind of work with the senior most executives in the organization, right? Because these kinds of change cannot be made by somebody without the authority to bring about these kinds of change, right? A lot of this has to be top-down approach, and even, I mean, beyond that, right? There is really no parallel as an MVP in ecosystem building. For example, I mean, for products, we talk about a lean approach where you're able to just test out one or two hypotheses, quickly take some things to market, test out a couple of hypotheses, and then pivot if needed, right? Whereas for an ecosystem, given that the grain of what we're doing is much bigger, it always involves far more, just upfront thinking, upfront planning for sure. And also it requires a lot longer timelines to actually see the effect of what you're putting in. So even, I mean, there are, even if you were to take the ecosystem approach, a lot of the underlying concepts will still ride on your product thinking, right? So once you're able to identify at an organization level what your ecosystem strategy should look like, and once you're able to kind of work backwards and identify, okay, what is that thin slice, or what is the pilot of this going to look like? What do I need to test out? A lot of them are still riding on your typical product practices underneath, right? And hence, it is important for you to work on the same kinds of principles in terms of, capability building, trying to not, just carry forward your legacy for the sake of it, right? Be open, be brave, be open to possible, possible failures coming along your way, even if they were to kind of eat into your reputation. I think it is important to still, be brave or courageous around taking these bets. Be quite intentional about how you approach them, or how do you kind of string them together in an incremental fashion to actually realize your ecosystem view.
Yeah, thanks, Ramya, for that.
Yeah, thanks, Pavan.
Okay, do we have any more questions?
Okay.
If not,